Organized money.
So we have a kind of fast-moving story that we're going to be covering today. It is a very weird story that involves consolidation in agriculture, but also a financial bailout. It is a bailout by the Trump administration of Argentina. And in particular, it looks very strange though, because the Argentine president is name is Javier Milei. He's a kind of libertarian rock star type who's very popular and prominent and aligned with the conservative MAGA movement. And then, last week, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said, we're going to lend you $20 billion. And that's because the country is on the rocks. And this has all sorts of weird implications. Why don't you walk us through like a quick timeline of why Argentina is on the rocks, why they need a bailout, and then we can get
Yeah,
to the show.
sure. So the nominal reason was that there was an election in the Buenos Aires, the state of Buenos Aires, which is where most of the people live, frankly, in Argentina. And
I like this,
Malay's,
like, frankly, like, I'm going to be honest with you, that's where most people live.
well, okay, yeah. Let me do it again.
Sorry.
Uh, the the nominal reason was that there was an election in the state of Buenos Aires, which is where most people live in Argentina, and Milei's coalition did very poorly in these elections, and so the nominal reason is, oh, Milei is doing poorly, and that means his wonderful program might not survive, and the horrible Peronists are going to come back into Argentina and take over the government, and then nobody's going to get paid because they're all a bunch of profligate spenders, and so international markets get roiled. That's the fake reason. The real reason is that in the reason that Milei's coalition did poorly in the elections is that inflation's going back up. The unemployment is bad. The austerity has caused a lot of harm in the country. And the economic program that was feted by the likes of Noah Smith and everybody else is this wonderful triumph of free markets is actually not working. And, most countries, when one by-election happens poorly for the ruling coalition, it doesn't send the markets into turmoil. The reason that it's sending the markets into turmoil in this case is that it's proof that this unpopular regime in Argentina is performing badly.
So why does this matter to us, right, in America? And because it is super weird. I wrote about it this weekend, and it's roiling farm state politics in America,
Right.
and
There's
it's
a
causing
whole
like
Yeah, there's a whole kind of agriculture element to this that is making the people, and many of them who support Donald Trump and trust Donald Trump, look at what he's doing to bail out their own competitors in the global marketplace and say, "What are you doing?"
right. So this is we've had farmers on the show to talk about problems in rural America. It's particularly bad in what are called the row crop sectors right now, just the
Right.
economy, the agricultural economy. It's not a crisis, but it's like row crop means things you grow in rows. So that would be like corn and soy and stuff like that, as opposed to,
It's
cattle.
the commodity crops that are sold
Yeah,
largely abroad to feed cattle and other livestock.
right. They're not doing particularly well, and the costs have been going up. The cost of inputs have been going up, and so there are lots of implications here. But what it is doing is it is roiling up this really big debate. But that debate is largely happening on the right, so it's not something that I think liberals and Democrats who mostly live in and near cities are paying attention to. Just to give a stat, 78% of voters in agricultural counties, which are counties that have a substantial amount of income from agriculture, voted for Donald Trump. So this is they're basically all Republicans here. So this is a very weird story, and it starts with what sounds like a foreign country that is far away and a bailout that is like kind of strange and complicated, but it actually gets to whether Donald Trump's coalition can be sustained going forward.
Yeah, and it
So
gets to more than that. It gets to also international economics and the way in which the IMF has put its thumb on the developing countries of the world. It gets to the financialization of the economy and a whole host of other things. So we have some great people to talk about that. The first is Matthias Vernengo. He is a professor of economics at Bucknell University, and he's part of the affiliated faculty in Latin American Studies. And we also have Rohit Chopra, a friend of the show, former director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a part of the Federal Reserve. And we're going to talk to them right now on Organized Money.
Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button so that more people can get exposed to Organized Money. Really appreciate it.
Matthias Vernengo and Rohit Chopra, thanks for Rohit coming back and for Matthias for coming on Organized Money.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
So, Matthias, I think we probably need some background here. Some of this, it's a very long and sordid history, I think, of Argentina's economic issues since the Peron era. But if you could give us sort of a capsule sketch of what Argentina's economy has looked like in this time leading up to Milei's election.
Fair enough. I don't think we need to go to Peron. I think part of the of the myths of Argentina is that this crisis was caused by, to some extent, the populist left, and Peron enters into that sort of category.
Sure.
In ways in which, I don't know, perhaps in the United States, people tend to blame or used to, at least Reagan, everything on FDR and the New Deal. So the current crisis, if there is a long history, it starts with the military coup in 1976. And the first of 4 neoliberal experiments in Argentina. So the military coup was the first one. They did the exact same policies that Milei is doing with the support of the IMF. Then to show that Peronism is not as monolithic as people think, in the 1990s with Menem as president, and he was a Peronist, elected to promote the left of center policies and did a 180 and promoted neoliberal policies. It's Milei's hero, I should say. Then and that ended in a brutal collapse and a default. And to contextualize things, that default that we had, it's one of many, I think 9, depending on how you count and whatnot, going back to the 19th century. That default was resolved by the Kirchners, by the sort of left-wing Peronism that returned in the early 2000s. So there were 2 big renegotiations with debtors in 2005 and 2010. They're based on what these renegotiations are, the ability to repay. So countries that default, contrary to what people think, they do pay back. That's why financial markets do come back to Argentina, because we're good payers. You just give them more time to pay at a more reasonable interest rate, but everything is paid, so to speak. There is a haircut, again, based on the ability to pay. But people that sold, many people that hold the bonds and sold them out, actually made a lot of money out of Argentina. That's why they come back. Right. And those were resolved in 2016. Macri, the third neoliberal experiment, he paid the vulture funds. The Elliott Fund and others, they fund the Republican Party, I should say, here in the U.S. And that allowed Argentina to come back to international financial markets. So it took 14 years from the last default to resolve those issues, but things were resolved. In the short 4 years of the Macri government, foreign debt in dollars in Argentina more than doubled. And Macri, by 2018, had to go to the IMF. His team included the current central, finance minister, and his head of his central bank, the president of the central bank at that time, is the current minister of deregulation. It's the same people. When people say Milei is absolutely new, not true. It's more or less the same people that started the current crisis, because in 2018 they got to the IMF, biggest loan in the history of the IMF, and Argentina only, they lost the election in 2019, even though the IMF kind of influence, as Trump is trying to do right now. They lost the election. a moderate Peronist government came. Cristina Kirchner, who is sort of the symbol of the more progressive side of the Peronist party, was the vice president, but not in control. They allowed to push the IMF payments, further down the line. But the crisis was never resolved. The current crisis is the continuation of that crisis. So we're still in the crisis of 2018, and we needed in April of this year another bailout from the IMF, and that was not enough. And we got essentially, a promise of $20 billion directly from the Trump administration, from the Treasury.
So, what is Milei? What is Javier Milei's promise? Like, what was his economic agenda, and what has he been doing?
So the economic agenda is, if there is a difference between Milei and previous neoliberal governments, is that it's a very radical deregulation of the economic system. It is a fundamentalist view of market society. So everything should be eliminated. The government should have minimal sort of intervention in the government. So from that point of view, it's a more radical view of what was done before. But essentially, it's not the same. No difference what used to be called the Washington Consensus. The regulation, liberalization, privatization. There's less stuff to privatize. Argentina has been through rounds of this since the 1970s, as I told you. So it's not like there is a significantly large sort of welfare state in which people are receiving sort of large amounts of transfers, and there is no poverty in Argentina. So poverty rates are very high. They were very high before Milei. The situation was already dire. So it's not. So what he brought of supposedly new was that he promised a large cut in spending. And fiscal surpluses. The notion was that the fiscal surpluses were behind the inflationary crisis in Argentina and of the external crisis, and that would solve all the problems. It is a complicated issue. It's hard to explain in very short time. But what I want to make clear is that it's a confusion of two different problems. Argentina has a problem that we borrow in foreign currency and need to repay in foreign currency. To pay in foreign currency, what we need is exports. It's the only way to, you either borrow dollars or we export stuff that other countries want and we have the dollars to pay back. The fiscal situation does have a relation to that, but it's very indirect. If the government goes and spends in pesos, what they do is by stimulating the economy, people can go and buy things, and some of those things will be imported things, which cost us dollars. So it's not like fiscal policy has no effect. It does. And one may have a discussion of what was the sort of right fiscal policy, but the deficits in Argentina were not particularly large. Nothing that, by American standards, they were smaller than the American deficits, as a share of GDP. So that's not what was causing the Argentinian crisis. What was causing the Argentinian crisis is that we didn't export enough for the amount of debt in dollars that we had. We couldn't pay the dollars, not the domestic debt. And so what he did is, just to finalize on that, he held the exchange rate. All stabilization plans, left wing, right wing, of any vintage, what they have to do in order to stop inflation is stop the depreciation of the exchange rate, and that's what he held. He held the exchange rate. The fiscal surpluses were less relevant for stabilization and more important to do what he wanted to do with the government, to cut social transfers, to make things more difficult for people at the bottom of society.
Yeah, and so this need for dollars, right, to have that exchange rate stabilization is, what sends in some. I mean, it seems to me that the reason that the IMF and the World Bank and these international development institutions are needed over and over again is because of this peg, the fact that there is this insatiable desire for dollars, which is true if you go there, because I've been there and I've seen it myself personally. But it seems like the cycle is that these international organizations come in and they seek certain guarantees in exchange for their debt issuance. And in this case, and at least initially, it seemed like the IMF and the World Bank, they gave, I think, $42 billion to Argentina. Are they in favor of this program? I mean,
in 2018 was the original loan was supposed to be $56 billion. We ended up getting something like 44,
right.
but
And
it
now
could have
that's
been 42.
doubled.
And
That's
now
been
another
doubled
20.
by Milei.
Yes,
Yeah,
another
almost,
20.
almost
So,
doubled by Milei. So
Why does Argentina need dollars? Like,
so
why can't
all
they
develop.
just on a basic level?
Well, we don't need $20 billion. So, but the needs of developing countries are associated to basic things that we don't produce. So if you think of the simplest things of capital goods, if we're gonna try to produce cars, a lot of the machinery comes from abroad. And so there are many things, intermediary goods, things that you need to produce other things. Argentina is not, I mean, some countries are, it's even worse. Argentina is a producer of foodstuff. So what I always say, the most incredible thing is when we have hunger in a country like Argentina. That makes no sense. Why? Because we produce enough food to feed not just Argentinians, but the rest of the world. But we still need, we're behind in the process of development. There are many things we don't have. And if you want computers, we import computers. People need computers to live and iPhones and whatnot. We produce certain things. We're industrial. We produce geostatic satellites, satellites that stay right exactly and move around with Earth and are always on top of Argentina. We produce cars and airplanes and I don't know, nuclear reactors. By the way, Milei has cut all of the funding for all of this kind of research that produce local things in Argentina. But we need a lot of stuff to produce those things, and the stuff that we do not produce to have the patterns of consumption that are more or less what a middle income country would have. So dollars are needed for that. And of course, you can only live without your means. In this case, it's very clear that unless you export enough, you're in trouble. I should say the crisis was exacerbated in the previous government. And, I don't necessarily, I participated in one of the Kirchner governments at the central bank long ago, but part of the story was we have 4 terrible drought years that the main export of Argentina, which are soybeans to China, collapsed. And so we had less dollars. So it's a combination of if interest rates go up, and normally the payments of interest on the debt are with fluctuating interest rates. If interest rates go up and the United States hike interest rates, the Fed to stop inflation, at the end of the pandemic and whatnot,
okay.
And the prices of the commodities you export fall, or worse, you don't produce as many because of a drought or something like that, you're in trouble. You cannot pay. So that's the story. So it's not really a fiscal story, although it has fiscal implications. It's really an external question. And so people speculate to say Argentina is not going to be able to pay. So what do you do if you think Argentina is not going to be able to pay? You run for the exit and you get the money. So a lot of the money, and I want just to put one more thing on that, a lot of the money that came into Argentina, the financial, the Treasury Secretary, our finance minister, he's from the Argentinian Wall Street. He's from we call it the city in Buenos Aires. So he's from the city. He comes from the banks. He is a speculator. The money came in and the money went out. And who's holding that money? A good chunk of that money is Argentinians that bought the dollar and put it in accounts outside of Argentina. So it's a collusion between the international financial system, hedge funds, and the local elites that sort of benefit from this. So Argentina is broke, but the Argentinian elite is doing very well.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at, that the IMF and these international organizations, along with foreign hedge funds, they seem to like this situation. But I want to take us up to date and bring Rohit in.
What are they going to use the money for?
Well, the reason is that they need dollars to help prop up their struggling currency. They are seeing their currency value plummet, and the only thing that will save them is lots and lots of dollars. So normally they would get that through the market, but they're running out of options, and so they are running to Donald Trump to get it.
If I may,
Actually, Matthias might have a better answer.
No. I want to complement what you said. So the other thing that it's important in that context is that there is an unpopular thing that you have to do if you want to get the money from the market. And they were only doing it at the very end now. And I say this because I did fight from the central bank in Argentina in a popular government, not this one, to do that. So you have to hike the interest rate. The United States hikes the interest rate, money comes to the US, you lose money, so flight of capital out of Argentina. So money comes to, international markets. They go to whatever, not necessarily to the US. They could go to the Cayman Islands. But you have to hike your interest rates. In the very recent sort of months since they got the IMF loan in April, they have hiked interest rates significantly in Argentina. The problem of that is that it causes problems for the domestic economy. There are ways around that. When I asked to, we're talking 15 years ago, to hike interest rates, I said we provide credit through other mechanisms, through public banks and so on and so forth. The example of that was Brazil and Lula. Lula did that Brazil has very high interest rates at this moment because of the United States, and in order to protect the exchange rate, but they didn't need a bailout. What did they do? They have a very high interest rate, which for Lula is problematic politically. And by the way, the U.S. is also doing terrible things to Brazil and tariffs and whatnot to prop Bolsonaro, and so it's similar. And Brazil has a lot of soybean exporters too. At any rate,
Right.
you have to do unpopular things. So here you have what Argentina would have to do is unpopular things that Milei is not willing to do.
Rohit, what are some of the reasons that the Trump administration has used to justify the bailout to Argentina, aside from the ideological, we love Javier Milei?
Well, I think they could pretextually say that a collapse or a deterioration in Argentina would somehow have a domino effect on the US. I don't really buy that. The US dollar, I think, is unlikely to face an enormous amount of stress from Argentina. But there's also those who think that this is a national security imperative. Argentina does have some real stocks of minerals, including lithium, which is used to make like electric car batteries. Some people might think that if the US doesn't step in, that China will fill the void in that geopolitical race for minerals.
In the wake of a local election in Buenos Aires that was not did not go very well for Milei, the Treasury Secretary here, Scott Bessent, offers a financial lifeline, and because of that trigger, and it was a political bailout as much as it was a financial bailout. So, Rohit, could you talk about what the Treasury Secretary offered here and the political contours of it?
Yeah, and here's some important background on this. For the past 30 some years, Americans have seen the Treasury and our Federal Reserve in some ways routinely engaging in bailouts. In the 1990s, we saw it with Mexico in 1997, with Thailand and others in Asia. And fast forward to today, the Treasury Secretary still has a pot of money that he can use really for the purpose of stabilizing the US dollar. And that's an important part of this. But there's really not many guardrails on that. So what we heard from Scott Bessent is that he would be prepared to take large and forceful action to prop up Javier Milei's government, really in advance of a big midterm election coming up. Now, look, Argentina is an important economy. It's one of the biggest economies in Latin America. But it is ridiculous to suggest that troubles in Argentina are going to have a material impact on the US dollar. And that's why it is inviting questions about what is the purpose of this. We're seeing reporting about certain hedge funds that may have ties or political connections who might see big windfalls. And we're also seeing what is a long history of Elon Musk getting close to Milei, others from the MAGA movement, if you will, cozying up to this politician. And I'm really worried that this is much more for the purpose of swaying an election than protecting the stability of the dollar.
So there is an element here of, oh, it's all a bummer, right? The Treasury Secretary is doing something corrupt and it's terrible, right? Which is true. Of course, they're doing bailouts. Bailouts are a common thing now. And there's all these comical right wingers who were, and just like normal economists who thought Milei was awesome. One of the funny things, though, let's go to the comedy of this bailout because it is ridiculous. US farmers are really mad. Right? There's weird politics here. So, Rohit, what's going on like in the US? Because this has gotten some very odd opposition.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm seeing a lot of talk about. So let's really set the stage here. The US, Trump has gotten into a trade war with China, levying big tariffs on Chinese imports, and the Chinese responded with a whole series of actions, including freezing the shipments of rare earths, but also to essentially stop all purchases of soybeans from US producers. And that actually is pretty big. Our soybean producers, they export a huge chunk of their harvest to China every year to feed all the hogs, cattle, and poultry that China needs to feed its population. And we are seeing every single day, Matt, more and more soybean producers facing financial failure. A new harvest is coming, and they are facing production costs that exceed any price that they can get in the market. And we also see, by the way, that guess where China is filling some of the gap since it's no longer buying from the US? They're going to Argentina. And in fact, they have booked a lot more cargo ships just in recent days to get Argentine soybeans into Beijing and Shanghai. So the net result of this is more pain for US soybean farmers. And ironically, the bailout of Argentina is facilitating this more. Look, I think China is laughing at the US on this, and Javier Milei is now, in some ways, a pawn for them in their trade war against the US.
And I want to get into a little bit more of that. But Matthias, my understanding is that when this bailout was announced, Argentina immediately removed their export tariffs on grains like soybeans so they could capitalize on the trade war happening over there. And the reason I know this is because there was a text from the Agriculture Secretary of the U.S., Brooke Rollins, to Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, which was captured on an AP photo, which says, yeah, we're in big trouble now because Argentina just got rid of their export tariffs on grains. So, I mean, how is Argentina now that to sort of draft off of this trade war and use that to their advantage?
So they reduced the export tariff. They eliminated the export tariffs. This is essentially. There were many protests in Buenos Aires. I mean, the streets were filled with people protesting some cuts on
that's
transfers
just
to the government
that's just a Tuesday in Buenos Aires.
Yes, yes, and the reduction of the tab because they're cutting the expenditures on essential things, universities and whatnot, not very different than here. And at the same time, given this is essentially what this is a big tax cut to exporters and the export companies and so on and so forth that don't have to pay on the grain exports anymore, so to zero. They are also trying to get them to bring the dollars. So when an exporter gets the dollars, they have a certain amount of time to go to the central bank and sell the dollars and get pesos in exchange, and the central bank is supposed to keep the dollars. This is part of the pressure of the IMF, I should say, too. I don't know that the IMF did tell them to do that, but the IMF has asked the Argentinian government to accumulate reserves, and they have failed to do that. So talking about the failures of economists that think that Milei was great. He has not something that is essential. So if you want to, people talk a lot about having an orderly macroeconomic sort of policy. And orderly in the case of Argentina would be to have, the central bank accumulate reserves. All central banks of developing countries have significant amount of reserves to manage the exchange rate. So what Rohit was talking about, the US has less need to do that, but certainly that was a failure. Again, it shouldn't be a surprise that these policies end up benefiting a small group of people, in Argentina. So this is to the benefit of the exporters and to the detriment of society at large.
That's funny. So it's a little bit like picking. So this is not a bailout of Argentina. It sounds like it is a bailout of hedge fund investors through Argentina, and then a small group of soybean exporters.
Well, also, if I may, it's also, the speculators in Argentina, people in the financial markets in Argentina are as much as the hedge funds in the United States. So they're also getting their money out. So I sometimes people, I want to make clear.
I'm not trying to be prejudiced against hedge funds in Argentina.
No, but I mean, the Argentinian elites are doing very well.
Actually, I am.
Yeah.
But Matt, this is actually a really key point, which is that in so many of these financial bailouts, you see a few common things. One is that there's never enough resources for key domestic priorities, but somehow at the drop of a hat, the Treasury Department or the Fed finds a way to intervene. Two, it is rarely individuals, households, families, consumers, workers who actually benefit immediately. There ends up being windfall profits for Wall Street or whatever types of financial speculators are. And the third, there always seems to be absolutely no accountability for the individuals who helped to cause this. I think I want this bailout, which I hope gets stopped. But this should be a lesson that all of these big political institutions, the IMF, the chief of the IMF, essentially has also endorsed Javier Milei, which, by the way, he essentially openly takes political advice from his dead dog. This is a strange individual. And on top of that, how we have to put in place a way to end the sense of leaders telling the public, oh, no, there's not enough for your high cost of living, but there's plenty to bail out a foreign country or a set of big financial institutions, and just trust us, it will trickle down to you.
If I may say something on the IMF here, the IMF intervened both in the elections in 2019 in Argentina, in which gave a humongous amount of money essentially to try to prop up Macri's government, and they did sort of again in 2023. They asked the previous government to devalue the currency, which accelerates inflation significantly in between the primary and the actual election, with a significant acceleration of inflation at the end of the previous government that had an influence on the election.
So these kind of political bailouts are endemic, because what Bacen has said is he specifically tied future investment and assistance with principal reduction to Milei's outcome in the midterm elections, which are happening in October
26th. Yes.
Yeah. And the head of, I believe the CEO of Chevron chimed in and said, "We love it. We're totally going to invest."
But the other thing is that the IMF does have an internal sort of review process, and the report on Argentina is very clear that they thought that many members of the board voted against and thought that Argentina in 2018 should not have received a bailout.
Well, that's the interesting thing here is that, and particularly in 2020, like earlier this year, actually, they got $20 billion from the IMF. They got another $10 billion from the World Bank, or another $12 billion from the Inter-American Bank, all these weird little pots of money. And the IMF staff was kind of opposed to it. So it's like even the IMF was like, "Whoa, guys, this is crazy." But there's a weirdness to Javier Milei that we haven't got into, and I want to read a couple of some of the people who are behind him, because he is not just some random leader of Argentina. He's a global rock star in some ways, like a kind of was considered the toast of Davos a couple of years ago. That's what Felix Salmon said. So here's some of the people that are super into him. So Michael Milken, right? Disgraced junk bond king. I guess we need an opposite of the word disgraced because he was regraced somehow.
Yes.
There's a billionaire, Stan Druckenmiller, who's influential, the head of the IMF, Maria Bartiromo, Elon Musk, of course. The Economist has been running like a series of love letters. The Washington Post, Newsweek, the Hoover Institute. We see there's a bunch of British think tanks, the Cato Institute.
This is a real
Donald
all-star
Trump.
team. This is a real
Yeah,
murderer's
Nigel.
row.
You could say,
Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson.
many,
Wait.
many. Larry
I haven't
Summers
gotten to the
probably.
weirdest ones.
Okay.
I want to get to the weird ones. Roger Stone. Okay, Roger Stone say a man rarely has the opportunity to actually meet his heroes. I worked for Ronald Reagan. I worked for Donald Trump, and now I have met El León, the lion in my badly pronounced Spanish. Javier Milei, Carrie Lake, the very weird right-wing Arizona Senate candidate. Yeah, Vivek Ramaswamy, who is now running for Ohio governor. Ben Shapiro, Mark Levin, and it's just like the list goes on and on and on, and they have all these strange reasons for loving this guy and thinking he's a rock star. He came to CPAC. He was on stage with Elon Musk with a chainsaw. What is going on here? Why do they love this guy so much? It feels like this isn't just a normal corrupt bailout. Not to be like these corrupt bailouts are normal, but what is happening?
There are two kinds of people in this. I think one is just the histrionic sort of thing. He does talk. I have a friend, an Argentinian friend, that says that he also talks with his dog. He just doesn't expect the dog to reply. But I think that those things he's mediatic. It's like why Trump? Why would people? I mean, he cannot put two words together, and yet he's popular, and continues to be to some extent with certain part of the base. So I think that's part of that. What I'm more concerned is, when he's current minister of deregulation, the one that eliminated many ministries and is doing all of this crazy stuff in Argentina. It's a well-known, well-reputed economist, Sturzenegger. Federico Sturzenegger studied here, Ivy League University. When he came out as central banker and led to the bailout of the IMF in 2018, he was hired. He was brought here, taught courses, published in the Brookings Institution. He's close friends with Larry Summers. The question is, and my answer to you, why is he so beloved? Because the connections are with Wall Street and with the hedge funds that make money. So they are making money to a lot of people. Even if Argentina goes down and gets broke, and it will take us 50 years to repay this whole thing, and we will repay. That's the other part of the lie. We will repay. The Argentinian people will repay all of these debts. But they will make the money.
It actually reminds me of Basent. Right, he's a very has a good pedigree, and he comes in and is doing Trump's bidding. But I want to get back to the ag part of this, Rohit, because we have another level to this, another layer to this, in that Trump was asked about this because he's getting some feedback from farmers and from senators from farm states like Chuck Grassley saying, this is a real problem. You're bailing out the country that is destroying the farm, or at least the soybean economy. And so Trump last week in the Oval Office started talking about paying farmers to compensate for these lost markets in soybeans, which are moving to Argentina, which Trump is also paying to bail out. Make that make sense to me.
I can't do that easily. But you know what it reminds me of, Dave? When there was massive bailouts in 2008 for Wall Street, and then for some political cover, they throw a little bit to homeowners and consumers who were ravaged by a foreclosure crisis.
They pretend to anyway. But.
And here's what's more difficult though about just giving some additional funds to farmers. You know, they're talking about, well, maybe we'll give some tariff dividend to the farmers. We'll give them a few hundred or a few $1,000s. We're not actually talking about people needing a little bump up to survive. Some of their sales have plummeted, dropped by over 50% or more. They are going to lose their farm. The number of farm bankruptcies has surged this year. Soybean farmers, especially, are filing. It has eclipsed by far the last year's numbers. And I don't know if a lot of farmers are going to buy that if they get a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s, this will solve this. So I think the administration is in a real pickle here because they are facing real pushback from the soybean farmers themselves, as well as potentially creating more problems by bailing out Argentina in ways that will further undermine U.S. soybean exports.
You can tell how desperate they are because the Brooke Rollins, who's the Secretary of Agriculture, had to promise to do antitrust against big agribusiness, right? And like you don't do that. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that they're going to do it for a variety of reasons. They could, but like if they don't do that unless they're really desperate.
Yeah, and that's something they need to do that they've heard for years and years and years and years from farmers about some of those agricultural conglomerates, the abuses of seed patents. So Matt, I think, is right here, is that the fact that they're chirping up about it shows that they're feeling some heat.
But let me ask just, Joe, I want to ask you a question about that, which is, all right, so we've got this bailout, we've got this sort of weird opposition. What are the Democrats saying? What should they say? What's the appropriate policy response here?
Well, you would hope that you'd see a senator really go to the floor and ask unanimous consent to put an immediate moratorium on the Treasury Secretary using funds for an Argentine bailout. You ideally want to put people on the record objecting to this and ideally forcing a recorded vote. Democrats need to show that Congress has a voice and people need to say which side of this that they are on. I am actually worried we are seeing so much silence instead of action. And more broadly, long term, we need to start seeing Democrats and a lot of Republicans who will agree with them that they should be the ones debating whether to give aid to foreign countries based on whatever the considerations are, rather than just having a pool of funds, tens of billions of dollars, to be used for bailouts with very, very few guardrails.
And there's another layer to this in terms of policy responses, because just as we're talking about how it's inadequate to prop up other countries with money instead of dealing with their structural problems, it's the same thing in the agricultural industry, where we're trying to compensate for these changes in the economy with just throwing out some money that we find in the cushions of the couch, when there are real structural issues with input costs, with consolidation, et cetera. What would be a better policy set of options there, rather than scrambling to fix the problems that we're already causing?
Well, you need to actually address this long-term problem of the enormous concentrations in almost every part of the agricultural supply chain. We have seen there being intense consolidation on every piece of it, whether it is poultry, whether it is beef integrators, whether it's seeds, whether it is pesticides and fertilizers. My own view is that the laws on the books exist. The Packers and Stockyards Act is a powerful law that we have still not seen any administration in the past 40 years actually use. There are all sorts of powers when it comes to how the USDA manages crop supplies and supports, how it manages our own stockpiles, how we make sure that individual family farmers actually can borrow to keep their farm alive. So it involves, Dave, banking and financial regulation. It involves antitrust. It involves trade. But the most important is we need a U.S. Department of Agriculture who will actually use those words on the text of our laws to actually help those farms produce what we need and to survive.
And then Matthias, if you could wrap this up here, the real question is, what should we be doing? Not just what America should be doing for Argentina, but what should Argentina be doing to work themselves out of this predicament that they've gotten themselves into? I'm not sure Milei is going to be the one that's going to bring that forward, but of course we have an election, a midterm election coming up that looks like the opposition is going to do pretty well. So what should happen there?
Pretend you're Milei's dead dog and give him advice.
Yes, there you go.
But I normally do bark into the void, so it's fine. So if I may, before getting to Argentina, because obviously I always want to emphasize our own responsibilities in doing some of the things that led to this crisis. But I think that there is an issue of how the international financial system has sort of worked for the last 50 something years. The regulation, a promotion of speculation around the globe. People talk about financialization, the idea that the financial sector has it's too large for what is needed for production, and so on and so forth. My students, 50% of my students go to Wall Street. So I'm just thinking, is that viable in the long run? How many people do we need in Wall Street? So that obviously has created a symbiotic relationship between the speculators in Argentina and a tiny elite that, ends up benefiting from these large, unpayable debts that we accumulate that lead to, local elites and hedge fund managers in Wall Street making money, and so on and so forth. So there is a general problem, and that's a regulatory policy that it's global. So it is about regulatory policy, as Rohit was talking, but this is financial regulation on a global basis, and then that certainly we would benefit from that kind of rethinking globally what we're doing. That's not in the cards, and I don't think that that's the something that we can talk for Argentina. In the case of Argentina, the solutions are not that complicated. The important thing is that these bailouts end up doing is that they come with conditions. The conditions of the Treasury would be even harsher than the IMF. And they tend to be something that punishes the population that did not benefit from these loans or the money. So what we need is macroeconomic policies that guarantee full employment, decent salaries, and so on and so forth, and that slowly allow us to repay the debt. We will pay the debt. As I said, we eventually will pay the debt. So the debt will be paid out of the Argentinian exports. But we need not just to export soybeans and lithium and natural gas that we're getting in great amounts from, Milei has been lucky, I should say. People, part of why he was able to hold exchange rate is that a gasoduct finished during the previous presidency started to be sort of, utilized as he came in, and then soybean exports went up, and he has all of a sudden natural gas, exports, lower imports, and so on and so forth. And all of this sort of allowed him to hold exchange rate. So we need to diversify those exports. We need to go to what we used to do. So the same kinds of things that Rohit was suggesting for agricultural, production in the United States, promoting local production that we need. As Dave asked, Matt asked a reasonable question. Why do you guys need dollars? Well, we need less dollars. So we need policies that reduce our need for borrowing money from abroad. We need policies that allow us to export things that have higher content of value added in Argentina, of the knowledge of Argentina. We do export. Argentina is a middle income country with some technology. We exported satellites and nuclear reactors. All of a sudden, Milei put a stop on that, because the IMF says you need to do fiscal adjustment. Well, he doesn't need the IMF, and his dog told him to do a fiscal adjustment, and so those things are terrible. So the same kind of policies that would help, in a sense, farmers in Idaho, or Iowa. I don't know where Iowa. I suppose it's where they produce
Iowa would
soybeans.
be the soybeans,
Yeah,
but
Iowa would be
that's all right.
soybeans. Yes,
You're
Grassley.
an
Yeah.
expert of another part of the world. That's fine.
Yes, no, fair enough. But I live in Utah for 10 years, so close enough
There you
to
go.
Idaho. So at any rate, it's the same policies that promote local production, middle class, income, and so on and so forth. So those are feasible. I mean, we've done those. We know how to do them. I mean, it's harder if you have the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States and the President of the United States campaigning for the opposite in Argentina. It makes it difficult.
There you go. Well, Matthias Vernengo, professor at Bucknell University, and Rohit Chopra, former director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Thank you both for being on Organized Money.
Thank you
Thanks for
having
having
us.
us.
So this story is actually closer to me than you might suspect. I have a bunch of family from Argentina, and I've actually been there several times. And the funny thing that you understand, like that we talked about this insatiability for dollars in Argentina. If you are walking down the main promenade, which is called Florida Street, you will see these people milling about. And their nickname is arbolitos, which is little trees. And they sit around and whisper to you, "Do you have any dollars?" It's like a drug deal. And the way that you exchange your currency for pesos in Argentina is you find one of these arbolitos and you go into a back corner and they take out of their boot a bunch of pesos and you give them dollars and they're really happy. And it's insane. And it's just the normal way that you exchange currency in Argentina. And it shows sort of this way in which our fates as the United States, the global hegemon, and Argentina's fate have been interlinked throughout the years, and they're just desperate for these dollar loans, whether it's on a personal level with tourists or whether it's at the international level with the IMF.
The Javier Milei thing, I've been paying attention to him for 3 or 4 years, and I'm not super into Latin American politics or anything. It's just that he has been, I would say of the level of a fairly prominent right-wing podcaster in American conservative movement circles. And I do pay attention to that, and also mainstream economist circles. So, one of the people that I pay some attention to is a commentator named Noah Smith, who kind of summarizes the neoliberal economic consensus, the types of parts of the Democratic Party that I think are kind of opposed to the anti-monopoly framework. And he used Javier Milei a couple months ago. He wrote a piece when Javier Milei looked successful, talking about how Javier Milei is kind of exhibit A in why we went too far in rejecting neoliberalism. Market-based reforms or market fundamentalism is actually quite good, and that was his argument. And this is not just Noah Smith used this argument, but a bunch of people have used this argument. They're largely libertarian, and most of them are on the right, but some of them are kind of on the center left, and they're basically aligned very closely with Wall Street. And so I was always very skeptical about Javier Milei, and I saw some people who focus on currency flows saying, yeah, this is not sustainable. But it does feel to me like we think of politics as kind of a domestic fight. There's a lot of, Trump is capitalizing on these pre-existing American trends versus these other ones. But I do think that what we are seeing is a kind of multiple global movements. Javier Milei had very close relationships with Israel. I think he converted to Judaism. Michael Milken was giving him an introduction and talked about he really likes Javier Milei. And it wasn't just because it's easier to invest in Argentina or these, Wall Street was doing really well. I mean, Argentina had the best returns for any country in terms of investment in 2024, but also because of Javier Milei's relationships with Israel. And there's this prominent picture of Javier Milei at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And it just feels like, and there's all these politicians in Spain and Portugal and Latin America and Hungary and like America all over the place talking about Javier Milei and how he's this beacon. And so it does really give a sense, that it, like, people talk about how Trump is pulling apart, the liberal international system, liberal rules-based order or something. But in another sense, what the focus on Javier Milei was showing is that he was building another global system, or there is another global system that is emerging, and it is really focused on this very right-wing fusion of cultural warring and financial domination. I mean, it's funny that he collapsed, but that's what this drags out for me.
I think what's interesting is it fits with what Matthias was saying about how this is actually the fourth neoliberal revolution in Argentina, that it has lines of connection to the Macri government. Some of the same people working in that government are working now in the Milei government, and it goes back to the dictatorship of the 1970s, and goes back to the Menem in the late 1990s.
And all of these guys had relationships with the Chicago School and with the Clinton administration, and this is not, what we're seeing today.
So as much as this
extreme,
but as much as this global populist rise, represents something new, it also represents something old. And you see these linkages with capital and the IMF as sort of the guarantor of global capital. You see that recur again and again, and here it's failing. And you have the US, which is allied kind of in a cultural context with Milei, but also allied in that it wants its hedge fund managers and investors to do well, coming in to save this project that can never be failed.
I will say there's one other, I think, observation that I learned when I was reading one of the pieces that you sent me in background, which is that, this isn't a positive political prediction. It's going to sound that way, but it isn't, because it's not like there's a populist democratic sort of world in waiting to take over. But one of the things that is similar to Javier Milei, to Trump, and to a lot of the right wingers around the world, is that his political coalition was built around this mix of traditional conservative elites and new working class people who were fed up with the center left, right? And there were some middle class swingy groups that were in there too. And what happened in 2023 in 2024 is people were basically satisfied with Milei. And then as the economy just wasn't doing well, which is kind of similar to the way things are in America, which is like the numbers look good, but people are not happy. Right. What happened is Javier Milei focused on culture warring stuff like trans kids and stuff like that. And people in Argentina were not interested. And then this latest election that kind of set off this financial crisis, Javier Milei's coalition looked exactly like traditional, minority coalitions in Argentina. It was basically just old rich people. And that is a real warning, I think, to the current Republican Party, which is that if they can't figure out a way to get out of the trap that they're in, which is culture warring and not really fixing cost of living things that people are worried about, or joblessness or whatever, then they are probably headed back towards just being the coalition of 2006, 7, 8 George W. Bush Republicans.
This is the ping pong that we see back and forth when people's needs aren't met, and they go back from the Democrats to the Republicans, and so on and so on.
Well, anyway, except in this case, the working class never gave the Republicans a shot, and they did under Trump, and that could be disappearing, right?
Right.
It's like a lot of people were kind of
more of a shot. I mean, obviously in 2016 he won, but that was not as robust a coalition. Anyway, all right. Well, that was a good show. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And next week we'll have another great episode for you on organized money.
Organized money.